You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Hey everybody, this is Brian McClanahan. It's episode 3 of the Abbeville Institute podcast, the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Glad to be back. We got a lot to talk about today. So let's get started. And before we get started, again, housekeeping. Want to mention again our conference in February 26th and 27th, 2016 in Charleston, South Carolina. The topic is the PC attack on the South. We'd love to see you out there. Have a lot of great speakers. It should be a very good time. The Friday night event will be a panel discussion on several different topics featuring myself, Don Livingston, Clyde Wilson, and Tom Fleming is what we're looking at now. So that should be a good time. And then, of course, we have an all-day conference scheduled for Saturday, including a Saturday night banquet with the featured speaker, Bertram Hayes Davis, the great-grandson of Jefferson Davis. So it's going to be a great event. We want to see you there in Charleston. Also, remember that the end of the year is coming up. The Abbeville Institute is a nonprofit organization. All of your donations are tax deductible to the full extent of the law, so please consider keeping the lights on here at the Abbeville Institute. We could use your support. We have more information on that at our website, www.abbevilleinstitute.org. All right, so I'm going to start today with a discussion of something that I saw this last week on Monday, and it has nothing to do with what we've published on the website, but it has something to do with us. And it was a piece that was put in Esquire magazine by a Bostonian writer named Charles Pierce. Now, Pierce has been writing since 1976, it says on his biography. Where to begin with this? It's a hit piece, actually, on the GOP, and somehow the Abbeville Institute got dragged into that at the end of the article. And it was a link to one of Clyde Wilson's pieces at the website on Confederate Flag Day. And the reason it was put there is because Pierce wants to be a little snarky, and I think this is where journalism is going in the current political climate. It's snarky. It doesn't even have any substance. It's not real journalism anymore. It's a way to belittle your opponents by pointing out their supposed inadequacies. And at the end of the piece, he talked about the fact that, we have a situation where the GOP may be up in air, the nomination's up in the air, and then we're going to get to South Carolina, and at that point, who knows what these crazy South Carolinians are going to do because, gasp, they might like the Confederate flag. And my gosh, to the mind of a Bostonian like Pierce, that is unthinkable. These hayseeds, these rednecks down there in South Carolina could determine the future of the GOP. And that's why it was put there. And it was the closing line was, it goes to South Carolina, and good luck with that. And in the good luck with that, it was linked to Clyde's piece. And then you get to the comments, which are absolutely hilarious and also indicative of the current political climate. And the one that had a lot of views was a climate where some guy that works for the U.S. Census Bureau goes on and comments about the fact that Clyde Wilson was distorting history, and don't you know that when Clyde Wilson said that the people that were resisting the Union, they were just all white, and he didn't include any black people in that. And so it's a way to demonize our side and make it out to try to show that we're just completely backwards and filled with hate. These kind of things that are common. And this all really started back in the 90s. And I'm going to get into this with one of the pieces we have to talk about this week. But the 90s really were a turning point, I think, in the way that the Southern tradition has been discussed and showcased. Part of that's because the 60s generation were in charge of things at that point. And so in the 90s is when political correctness really started gaining a foothold, and everything started spiraling out of control, and we're in the byproduct of that. And so you saw in the 90s this much more vehement and Stalinist view of the world, and of course the South. And somebody else commented, well, back in the 50s, when Clyde said that people like Eisenhower and Truman and others weren't upset, even Kennedy, There was no one who was upset to be seen with a Confederate flag, and that was because there wasn't Wikipedia at that point. There's no Wikipedia, so we can't go out and look at the Cornerstone speech or we can't go out and look at the Declaration of Causes from South Carolina, and we can't see that it really was slavery at the heart of everything. And now we have Wikipedia, so we can go do that. Now, if somebody says, I support the South, well, there you go then. You're just this evil bigot. There's nothing in the Southern tradition but race. And it's so preposterous to have that position. But this person that wrote that is from South Carolina. So what happened in the 90s is that all of this started getting beaten into the heads of college students, high school students, and we're really seeing the effect of that in the millennial generation. It's a sad commentary on the modern political discourse, that all you have is an attempt to show your supposed intellectual and moral superiority by pointing out an article about the South and the Confederate flag. And this is Yankee self-righteous delusional disorder, because they don't even understand their own history and their own position and in the North in regard to slavery before the war and the antebellum period. It's amazing to me how this easy narrative has taken hold of modern scholarship and how it's grown in pop culture. Charles Pierce is by no means a scholar, but he is a byproduct, and of course he's much older, but he's a byproduct of this very black and white view of American history. You've got self-righteous, moralistic Northerners against evil, horned-headed Southerners, and we're just all stupid down here, and we don't know any better. And it's amazing how this has just really become the dominant perspective in America. But this isn't new. I mean, the stuff we're going to talk about this week really points this out, and it all fits together with this idea, and how you have this distortion of history, this North over South vision of the world in America. And people have been talking about this for 30 years and longer. I mean, you even saw it in the speeches that were being produced in the 1890s. People were saying these exact same things, but it's gotten worse in the last 20 years. And I don't know if it's going to get any better anytime soon, but this is why we have the Abbeville Institute, to try to push the idea that there is something true and valuable in the Southern tradition. There is something to admire in the South. There is something that the South can teach America. And we need to listen. And I think that's what Donald Trump is tapping into in his campaign. It's the same thing that Nixon tapped into in 1972. It's this idea that those core American values really do come out of the South. And people are hungry for that. They're hungry for someone to say, hey, wait a second here. All this stuff, we're going way off the rails in everything we're doing. And there is something valuable about the American tradition, which the heart of that is the Southern tradition. So the first thing we produced on the website on Monday was a little interview with Kerry Roberts and Sam Smith, both who are Abbeville Institute scholars at the Off the Grid News Network. And it was a discussion of the Pilgrims. Now, this is, again, a nice example of where we are in modern historical discourse and scholarship. Everyone knows, who has any inkling of historical knowledge, that the Pilgrims are not the first Englishmen to establish a colony in North America. Yet, you would think, if you watched any television, you would think if you, around Thanksgiving, that the fact is, the Pilgrims were here first. They had the first civil government. They had the first Thanksgiving, all these things. Well, we know that's not true. And I discussed that last week, that Virginia was first in all of these things. But this Pilgrim myth hangs on. And the Pilgrims, there's actually a PBS series that's going to be put out that's very critical of the Pilgrims, and rightfully so. The Pilgrims, as Sam Smith points out in this interview, they weren't the Puritans. They were religious separatists. They really wanted to separate from society. They were utopians in a way, and that utopian idea, this somehow, it's in your mind. It's not real. This is exactly what we're dealing with in America today in terms of leftist ideologues. The America that they love is not the America in which they live. It's an America that's fabricated in their mind. And the Pilgrims are a nice example of that. They had left England in the early 17th century, gone to Holland. That didn't work out for them. So then they come over to America on the Mayflower, and they force every male member of the Pilgrim community to sign the Mayflower Compact. So it's not democratic. And they boot out the other entrepreneurs on board the Mayflower. They say, you can't be in our colony. And so this is a group of people who were facing quote-unquote persecution, who were persecuting themselves, anyone else who didn't think like them. So in that way, it's a strange ideology. Now, we can also look at this and say, well, people should be allowed to have self-determination. And of course, these people were coming here, and this was self-determination. They wanted to be able to worship freely and practice as they chose. But they weren't these noble people that are shown on television all the time, and they aren't the basis of America. This is something completely different. If you look at the Virginians, they just want to recreate English society here in the New World. It's not about creating something new. It's about recreating what they already had and what was good here. So you saw in the North with the Quakers, with the Puritans, with the Pilgrims, this much more utopian idealism that's going to take over. And in the South, you saw these two cultures, the Celts and the Cavaliers, who really just wanted to recreate what they had over in Europe. For the Celts, it was getting away from the English and living in the hills, but their culture, the culture they brought with them and what they established was very much like they had over in the British Isles before they got here. So this interview is really good because both Dr. Roberts and Dr. Smith get into that position on the Pilgrims and discuss the inadequacies of this north over south view of Thanksgiving and the north over south view of the founding of the British North American colonies. We need to rekindle Virginia because Virginia is the example that we should all look to emulate, not Pilgrim, Massachusetts, and later Puritan, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, that quote-unquote city upon a hill idea is something that's frankly destructive to real America. And so I think Dr. Roberts and Dr. Smith do a nice job of that. Now, so you can listen to that interview at our website. It's the title of the piece is Pilgrim Myths and Legends. So on Tuesday, we published a chapter from a book that Clyde Wilson edited in 1981. The title of the book is Why the South Will Survive, 15 Southerners Look at the Region a Half Century After I'll Take My Stand. And this particular essay is by John Shelton Reed, who is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And why this essay is so good, it was written in 1980. And here Reed is looking back at his life, and not just that, he's looking at the South in 1980. And this is 50 years after I'll Take My Stand had been written. So this is the 50th anniversary of that particular book. And the title of this piece is The Same Old Stand. And so he's looking back at this and he says, look, he says, it is still possible to combine an affection for the South with an appreciation of the virtues and strengths of the family farm and rural life. But someone who is not prepared to exclude most residents of the South from the category Southerner must recognize that it is no longer a matter of defending a Southern way of life against industrialism. Increasingly, that way of life is industrialism. So he's hitting at something in 1980. By 1980, the farm in the South was pretty much gone. We are, in the modern South, living in a society where we're commercialized, we're industrialized. Now, the South has long been, and I got back in the 90s, go back to that perspective in a second here. The South was always the counterweight, the opposite to this consumerism and industrialization that was going on in America. It had always been that other that people could strive for. Now, it's no longer the case in 1980, but the idea is still there. And so he says that there are people all over the United States who believe in this idea, but more in places like California than in the South. So the South has adopted, they've been reconstructed fully economically. They've adopted the economic model of the North. So what is it about the South that we're actually defending? And this is a question that we have to ask today. What is it about the South that's true and valuable in the Southern tradition? Well, he starts getting into that. And it's this Jeffersonian ideal of the South. It's not idealism because it actually existed, but we can use that as a model for the future. And this is something that Southerners need to be better at. It's apologetics. What is it about the South that we want to defend? And it's the Jeffersonian tradition. And that tradition is not dead. It's not something that faded away and has no relevance to modern society. It has every bit of relevance to modern society, but we just have to be able to talk about it. It's not the 4-year period of the war. It's not the causes of the war or why Southerners fought in 1861 or why the South seceded in 1860 and 61. That's important. It's the principles behind what they did, and that's independence and self-determination. That's Jeffersonianism. You can sell that to anybody. It's the same thing that was going on in 1775 and 1776. It's that cause of self-determination, limited government, self-government that has currency in the modern world, and that is the Jeffersonian tradition that we're trying to promote here at the Abbeville Institute. So he says, the small is beautiful motif is important, but you have to be able to offer something. And he asks, why do Southerners, most of us, love the South? Why should we? In these times, those questions must be rephrased as, what good is it? Is the South any different anymore from the rest of the United States? And if so, what differences are likely to remain, and what good are they? So he's asking a very pregnant question here, and it's prescient as well. We need to be able to define what good the South offers. People are naturally progressive. This is what Weaver was saying last week that he wrote in 1943. People are naturally progressive. History can be used as a model, as an example, and we should use it, but we find the good. It's what every historian has said. We find the good, and we promote that. What is good about the Southern tradition? What does it offer in modern society that people can come away with and say, yeah, we like that. We like what the South has to offer. So you have on one hand Esquire magazine this week pointing out, oh, look at these hayseeds in the South. They're just so mean and backwards, and we can't wait to pick on these people. Other people look at that and say, well, that's good. What they're offering is good. It's the counterweight to you, Pierce, and you, commenter, who has no idea what you're talking about. Why do we want to be with you anyways? I mean, that's the question that has to be asked. If you hate us so much, why did you fight to keep us in the Union in 1860, 61 to 65? So he goes on to a nice dialogue about his life, going into school in the North at MIT and later Columbia, and how this actually helped him define who he was as a Southerner. And a lot of people never get that. If they never leave the South, I mean, you can go on the internet now, and you can have their attacks come at you, and you start learning about the South and what it means. But to be a conscious Southerner, you almost have to leave it to see how important it is. And it's amazing. I have colleagues who talk about this, who have gone on to other places, and they start realizing, hey, wait a second here. There is something about who I am that's defined about where I'm from. There's something about the South that makes me unique. Something about where my blood runs that makes me unique. You can take a boy out of Dixieland, but you can't take old Dixie from the boy. And I think that's, you almost have to leave to find that. So he gets into his identity and coming to a realization that he had a Southern identity, and how this was actually very American, because he's in New York and he's around people of different identities, Italians, Jews, blacks, whatever the case may be, and he's realizing that, hey, they all have identities and they're great with that. That's cool. But yet, why can't he have a Southern identity? And he says that, the Southern identity had been demonized, and he actually says, no, time and Yankee textbooks had eaten away the core of Confederate sentiment. The title they had left was being undermined in the early 1960s by the Southern defenders of segregation who had pretty well appropriated the Confederacy's flag and anthem. Their considerable success in identifying their own lost cause with the earlier one, he felt, was a shame. He recognized that, like agriculture, like white supremacy, the war had helped to form the South, he knew, but he believed it had long since ceased to play an important part in sustaining it. Once again, it seemed his conclusions were only negative. So he's getting into this. Well, people identify the South with slavery, with segregation. But he realized that that was no longer the case. Here he is in the 1960s and 70s. And for most young Southerners, that wasn't what defined them. But they were still Southern. So he had to find what it was. There's something to chew on here. What it was that made him Southern. If it wasn't these things, if it wasn't, okay, we're living at Terra and Gone with the Wind. It wasn't the plantation. If it wasn't segregation, what was it that made him Southern? And so he starts getting into this. It's his identity comes from where he's from. And he points out that what it was that he could hang on to. He says, one particular aspect of our region's culture seems to be not only surviving under these new conditions, he's talking about industrialism and consumerism, commercialization, but actually thriving. This trait has always been present in the South's cultural ecology, but it benefits from the elimination of its natural competitors by urbanization and industrial development. I'm referring to what our regional variant of what used to be seen as the American trait of individualism. This is it. He hits it. And it's actually not something that had just appeared in the 60s and 70s. The South personified rugged individualism because the greatest American hero of the antebellum period was Daniel Boone. Everyone, North and South, wanted to be Daniel Boone. If you look at James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, it's Daniel Boone. Natty Bumppo is Daniel Boone. And so everyone wanted to be this guy, this rugged individualist, this hunter, this guy who blazes trails, a frontiersman, establishes land in Kentucky, this hero who helps save his family during the American War for Independence, this guy who's hunting out west into his 70s and 80s. This is the guy that people wanted to be, that repaid his debts even when it left him penniless. People looked at Daniel Boone and said, yes, that's the quintessential American. And he was Southern. That's the person we want to be, not Charles Pierce in Boston, Massachusetts, some snarky little nobody who wants to pick on the South. We want to be Daniel Boone, someone that did something heroic, someone who has substance, someone who means something to the American character and the American tradition. And this is exactly what Reed is hitting at. The individualism was allowed to survive in this new South. It's not that Southern culture was going away, but individualism was coming out of this and to a greater extent. He says, alongside the folkish, organic strain in our region's culture, however, there has always been a stubborn individualist, I'm as good as you outlook, a collection of cultural themes that competed with and undermined the demands of prescription, hierarchy, and organic community. The openness of early Southern society, the possibilities for individual mobility, meant that the would-be hierarchs of the South had to resort to slavery to keep their retainers in place. The varieties of Christianity that were equipped by their histories to legitimize a prescriptive order never fared well among these folk who needed encouragement to do their duty and the station in life to which it had pleased God to call them, at least not after they had the opportunity to choose something else. These two competing visions, the individualist and the organic, can be illustrated by a series of oversimplified contrasts, Jefferson and Fitzhugh, Baptists and Anglicans, yeomen and planters, Huey Long and Harry Byrd, perhaps uplands and low country. One of the unresolved contradictions of I'll Take My Stand, some critics have observed, is that of which South it is defending. In fact, the combination, however unstable or philosophically unsatisfying, may have something to be said for it, if each of these tendencies serves to check the excesses of the other. So he's saying there's different Souths, but one thing they almost all have in common is this rugged individualism. And he goes into this, and he says, respect for individualism and self-reliance is also increasingly evident in Southerners' economic views. In any case, the increasingly dominant Southern doctrine is an internally consistent one, perhaps for the first time, and it is a form of libertarianism. If, as I believe, the South is refining and beginning to exemplify a worldview that puts individual responsibility at the heart of things and insists that individuals should, and by and large do, get what they deserve, it presents some interesting homegrown features. One of the most common theoretical objections to pure libertarianism, that it destroys community, simply does not seem to apply to the Southern variety, as it is actually put into practice in most Southern towns and institutions. Community seems at least as healthy in the South as elsewhere, and I don't think it is merely as a residue from the region's pre-industrial past. Here again we can look at Southern churches as a useful microcosm of Southern society. If we can understand their cohesiveness, perhaps we can see the same processes at work in other Southern settings. So he gets into this discussion of religion and how different denominations get along just fine in the South. It creates community, even though there's individuals in this, but still community is evident. He says the old joke about both of our churches worshiping God, you in your way, we in his, summarizes an anomaly that has puzzled many observers of Southern life. Theoretical hostility toward other groups, other communities, and other regions is often combined with a sort of workaday pluralism that lets folks get along pretty well most of the time, although it wouldn't satisfy the sponsors of National Brotherhood Week. Southerners quite often tolerate the theoretically intolerable from outsiders, reasoning that what those people do is of no concern to us. An element of circularity defines outsiders, in part, as those who think or do the intolerable. Whatever else may be said about this solution, it seems to me that it is usually preferable to trying to make outsiders conform to insider standards, and always superior to concluding that there is nothing that could be called intolerable. There it is. The South looks at people who come in here and they say, well, we'll just let them do what they want as long as they don't bother us. It's the leave us alone mentality that comes from the Cavaliers and the Celts. This is why I brought that up at the beginning. All this stuff works together. Leave us alone. In return, Southerners would like a similar toleration for themselves. Nashville's Charlie Daniels sings about it in A Long-Haired Country Boy, suggesting that his critics should just leave him alone. And it should be noted, today's long-haired country boy is likely to be a loyalist member of a group of long-haired country boys who are tolerated by the rest of the community as long as they keep their intolerable tastes and habits to themselves and only knife each other. What has always particularly annoyed Southerners is not what others do among themselves, but others' attempts to make us do differently. Southerners, it seems to me, are usually willing to let the rest of the country, the world for that matter, go to hell any way it pleases, and won't interfere unless invited, an attitude learned at home. But it's only reasonable in this view to expect that others will keep their missionaries, inspectors, revenue agents, soldiers, and outside agitators at home. If they don't like the way we're living, what's it to them? So he's getting at the point that Southerners were surprised at all the attacks that are leveled against the South. Charles Pierce. Who cares, Charles Pierce? We don't tell you how to live in Boston. Why are you trying to tell us how to live down here? What do you care if we have a Confederate Flag Day rally? It's just to make yourself seem better and superior. That's the only reason a snarky little guy like Pierce would put a link in there. Oh, look how backwards these people are. We're so much better. Because these people are so stupid, if we have to let them make a decision, we're really in trouble. We should just, if it has to be determined before it gets to the South, because if Southerners decide, it's over. Because these people are just idiots. Southerners would say the same thing about them. Leave us alone. Reed continues. So what we have, I am suggesting, is a nested set of communities, a region composed of states, composed in terms of cities and towns, themselves made up of groups and associations and neighborhoods, down in good Burkean fashion to the level of the family and perhaps beyond. At each level, the criteria for membership and the definitions of the intolerable differ, but everywhere the love it or leave it principle applies. The result is communities and groups which enlist the loyalty of their members so long as they remain members, precisely because they are free to leave. Cash's savage ideal of conformity may well characterize relations within many Southern communities, while between communities a certain rough-and-ready tolerance, indifference really, prevails. We don't care what you do, just leave us alone. Sweep around your own porch, and who cares what they do somewhere else? And that's the important part of Jeffersonianism. This is what the Institute is getting at. And his conclusion gets to this. He says, what I have been describing is not an abstract blueprint, but a way of life, a set of unexamined axioms about the nature of association that I believe are widespread in the South and are likely to remain so. People are free to choose in many important matters and should bear the consequences. Association is based on shared values and beliefs. People are free to leave associations they find onerous and should do so. It is impolite to emphasize unavoidable differences in rank. Groups like individuals should be free to choose in many matters. Consequently, pluralism and decentralization are desirable policies, a Southern refraction of the Catholic principle of subsidiary. It is impossible to make a systematic list of these convictions, since they are not so much articulated as lived. Like any way of life, this one embodies contradictions, evasions, and blind spots that rigorous ideologues of any persuasion will likely find intolerable. Never mind, it seems to work, and many of us like it. More than that, it seems to me that these are among the most important shared understandings that set the young Tennessean and his fellow Southerners apart from their Northern friends. Clearly, one thing this set of understandings does is to provide a solid rationale, perhaps underpinning is the better word, for Southerners' continued insistence on our right as a regional and quasi-ethnic group to keep on doing some things our way, to hold out as a large and gristly lump in the national stew. One thing that sets Southerners off from many other Americans may be the conviction that groups like ours are entitled to be set off from the rest. This is freedom of association and self-determination, the heart of Jeffersonianism. He concludes, but however much Southerners may find Southern identity and Southern culture congenial and downright useful, the question remains whether the South has anything to offer the rest of the country. Alas, as I have explained, it is presumptuous to tell other people how to order their own affairs. Some have abandoned or never subscribed to the principle of individual responsibility, have no respect for self-respect, and regard the worldview I have described as hopelessly retrograde. They may have taken a wrong turn, but that is their prerogative. If they have, the consequences will be on them and on their children. So long as we are not obligated to save them from those consequences, they're entitled to the same toleration we have asked for ourselves. For our part, we should refrain from preaching at them and should seek to construct a society pleasing to man and to God. If we succeed, others can draw the lessons for themselves. That is a wonderful statement. Southerners just want to be left alone. We want to construct something in our own society that's pleasing to man and to God. And that can be the example. It's not a shining city upon a hill because we're not telling other people how to live like the Puritans were or the Pilgrims were, for that matter. What we're trying to do is say, let us live the way we want to live. We'll leave you alone. You leave us alone. But yet we have people like Charles Pierce who won't do that. We're always under attack. It's the assault. We're the other, the whipping boy. And that's why Southerners wanted to leave. It was, as I talked about last week with Bradford, it was these rhetorical attacks that really got under Southerners' skin. and why they said, we can't stand this anymore. We got to get out. It wasn't so much at what Northerners were doing as what they were saying. It's still today. It's not so much about what Northerners do, it's what they say. It's the snarky little comments about the South, and Southerners get tired of this. We want to live our own way and just leave us alone. And so when we get to the Kirkpatrick Sale piece in a minute, I'll talk about how that is important. But the Clyde Wilson Library piece for Wednesday was titled, Can the Republic Be Restored? Presidency. And this is a great little piece because he gets into the fact that the presidency has become the problem in American politics. And my forthcoming book in February does this exact same thing by discussing 13 presidents who were really bad according to the Constitution and 4 who were pretty good according to the Constitution. No one's perfect. And if you look at their oath of office, no one has ever done it perfectly in defending their oath. But some have done it better than others. And essentially, Clyde is saying here that, this first line, the American president began as Cincinnatus, a patriot called to the temporary service of his country. The president ends as Caesar, a despot of almost unlimited power presiding over a global empire. So we start with Washington, the American Cincinnatus. Now, I would say that Washington actually sowed the seeds for people like Jackson and Lincoln and on down the line with 2 things, and that would be the Whiskey Rebellion, his response to the so-called Whiskey Rebellion, and his neutrality proclamation, because he unilaterally, even though it was a good idea, declared neutrality, and Congress should have done that, not the executive. And, of course, he was taken to task by James Madison over this. And then his response to the Whiskey Rebellion allowed for people like Jackson and Lincoln to later use that as an example for what should be done when the states were, quote-unquote, in a state of rebellion. And he gets into the fact that Congress has punted its responsibility, its duty to rein in the president. And he says that the imperial presidency is a recent development. Andrew Jackson, through his popularity and choleric temper, slightly expanded the profile of the executive office. Lincoln, of course, usurped extra-constitutional authority with gay abandon. But it is interesting that most of his abuses of office did not become immediate precedents. When Grant left office in 1877, things returned to something resembling normal. And this is true. This is why no one likes the 19th century, the late 19th century, because it's boring. You have presidents who did what they were supposed to do. They adhered to their oath of office, for the most part. I mean, it's really hard to criticize many of the late 19th century presidents until you get to McKinley, and even he wasn't that bad. Cleveland was one of the best. But then you get to the 20th century. Lincoln was never worshipped as a god while he was president, only afterward. Theodore Roosevelt made the president into a public celebrity as well as a chief magistrate. His cousin Franklin was adored by millions as a kind of father and protector. It was perhaps not until Kennedy that the president was actually worshipped by servile people unfit for free government. And even there, the Kennedy adulation was to a considerable extent a trumped-up creation of the fawning media. It was not nearly as widespread as they would have us believe. It was Bush Minor who was our first emperor, able to do almost anything with only the merest murmurs of dissent from the Congress or public. He concludes, could the president ever again become what it was intended to be, a person of recognized ability and integrity, who is charged temporarily with seeing that the laws are faithfully executed and necessary relations with other governments are carried on, and nothing else? That's his question. I doubt it. We've gone too far. But perhaps we could get back to that. Maybe, if people would understand what the presidency is supposed to be. I don't have much hope. In my concluding chapter, I offered constitutional amendments which could be passed that would do some of these things. And that's where, if you look at the Confederate States Constitution, one thing they did that was really good was they gave the executive a one-time 6-year term. Because if you look at presidents, most of the time, the abuse really comes in the second term, not the first. Almost all the good ones have only served one term or maybe around 6 years. And the 4 I pick out are Tyler, who didn't even serve a full term. Cleveland served 2, but non-consecutively. So Even critics will say his second term was the worst, and I think he did some things in the second term that were not as good as the first. Calvin Coolidge served 6 years as president, and then Jefferson, I point out, his first term was good. His second term was really bad. So it's that first term, and maybe if you just limited them to 1 6-year term, things might be better. That's one thing that I think that the innovations in the Confederate Constitution got right. People say, well, the Confederate Constitution is just like the U.S. Constitution. Hardly. There are a lot of important changes that were made, and they looked at the old document and said, well, these are the things that need to be done to change it, to make it better, because we've suffered under some things, and this would rein in the executive branch. The Thursday piece was quite interesting. It was a chapter out of the book Rethinking the American Union for the 21st Century. And it was a speech that Kirkpatrick Sale made in Charleston in 2010 when we had an Abbeville conference there on secession. And this is a wonderful piece because it concisely identifies why the Jeffersonian tradition is important for America today. Not just for America, but for the world. And so he gets into an Aristotelian exercise in what it means to have good government. And so he starts looking at countries and how these countries, these small countries, factor in to good government. He says, of the 223 political entities, 45 are below 250,000 people, 67 below 1 million, and 105 below 5 million. In fact, 50% of nations are below 5.5 million people, and a full 58% are smaller than Switzerland's population of 7.7 million people. Obviously, most countries in the world function with relatively small populations. And looking at the nations that are recognized models of statecraft, there are 8 of them even below 500,000. The example of Iceland, with the world's oldest parliament, an unquestioned beacon of democracy, banking troubles aside, suggests that 319,000 people is all you would need to have an effective government. Going up a bit in size, there are another 6 models of good governance below 5 million. Singapore, Norway, Costa Rica, Ireland, New Zealand, and Estonia. And so he goes through all of these things. He says, look, GDP, there are great small countries that have vibrant economies. You don't have to have a monstrosity of a country to have a vibrant economy. In fact, he says it's the other way around. Smaller makes better economies. He says smaller makes more freedom. Literacy is often better in smaller governments. And he says this, a nation can be not only viable and sustainable at quite small population sizes, a model of more or less democratic and efficient government, but in fact can provide all the necessary qualities for superior living. Indeed, the figures seem to suggest that, though it is certainly possible to thrive at sizes under 1 million people, there is a more or less optimum size for a successful state, somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 million people. And it's not just population, it's also size, the size of the territory that matters. He says, in fact, 85 of the 223 political entities counted by the United Nations are under 10,000 square miles. That is to say, the size of Vermont are smaller. And he points out that these governments are usually pretty good governments. You don't need a big monster state. He says, if we go back to the measure of economic strength, the GDP per capita, small nations prove to be decidedly advantageous. So he says, small, let's face it, is not only beautiful, but bountiful. This is what we need to be selling to the American population, the Jeffersonian idea of self-determination. Live a certain way. You live your way, we'll live ours. Freedom of association. Create a government that's suitable for you and your people in a small area. And that is what people will flock to It's not big. It's not centralization. It's an example that people will flock to in their own way, in their own place. And so Sale says, in fact, I wish to propose out of these figures, and even more so out of the history of the world, that there is a law of government size, and it goes like this. Economic and social misery increases in direct proportion to the size and power of the central government of a nation. He calls it Sale's Law. The consolidation of nations into powerful empires leads not to shining periods of peace and prosperity and the advance of human betterment, but to increasing restriction, warfare, autocracy, crowding, inequality, poverty, and starvation. The reason for this, he says, is not mysterious. As government grows, it expands both its bureaucratic might over domestic affairs and its military might over external ones. That is the Jeffersonian idea. Jefferson loved to reform, but he was knee-deep in his own soil and looking at his own mountains. He would take care of his own backyard, but he could care less what happened 99% of the time anywhere else. He wanted to take care of Virginia first. He wanted to ensure that Virginia had religious liberty. He could care less about what happened in Massachusetts. So Sale continues, now that we have established this virtue of smallness worldwide, let us apply these figures to the United States and see what they tell us. Of the 50 states, just over half, 29, are below 5 million people. And then he goes into all the sizes of the different states. He says, in other words, 31 of the states, plus Puerto Rico, fall in a range where similar sizes in the rest of the world have produced successful independent nations. Those are the candidates for successful secession. And then he gets into geographic size and how many of these states could still be viable. But he concludes with wonderful 2 paragraphs. He says, it need not be all about population or geographic size. One might factor in cultural cohesion, developed infrastructure, historical identity, and such like. But that certainly seems to me to be the sensible place to start when considering viable states. And since the experience of the world has shown, indeed over and over again in the formation of nations since the 19th century, that entities in the 3 to 5 million range may be optimum for governance and efficiency, and some within a 1 to 3 million range, that is how to begin assessing bodies for the secessionist potential and their chances of national success. I hope all this Aristotelian examination is not regarded as a mere academic exercise, though a great deal of exercise, I assure you, has gone into it. I believe that it establishes an impetus for Americans who understand that their national government is broken and cannot be fixed, and who realize that the only hope to re-energize American politics and recreate the vibrant collection of democracies that the founding generation of the 18th century envisioned is to create truly sovereign states through peaceful, popular, powerful secession. Americans complain about what's going on in Washington, D.C. They have been duped into the nationalist perspective, the one-size-fits-all approach to American governance. When something is broken, we go to Washington, D.C. to fix it. When education is broken, we ask the presidential candidate, we ask the congressman, what are you going to do about education? What they should be doing, as John Shelton Reed said, is sweeping around their own back door and saying, this is what we're going to do here in pick your state. And you're starting to see this. This is the 10th Amendment movement again. No one in the 10th Amendment movement believes that state governments are perfect. They know they're corrupt. They know there's problems. But they're sweeping around their own back door. And they're saying, look, we're going to handle this problem here in our own state. We don't like the federal government telling us what to do because our culture is different from theirs. We don't want an unelected federal judge from California telling us what to do in Oklahoma. We don't want an unelected judge from Vermont telling us what to do in Alabama. And we don't want an unelected judge from Alabama telling you what to do in Massachusetts. You live your way, we'll live ours. And ours will be better because it suits our culture. It suits our political community. That's exactly what all this is about. The last piece of the week was by Dave Benner, and it's titled "Remembering Hugh Williamson." And when this was published, Clyde Wilson emailed me and said that he knew a descendant of Hugh Williamson in North Carolina who started writing a biography, but he gave up because the man was so boring. So Hugh Williamson is not an exciting or sexy individual of the founding generation, but he is important, primarily because of his belief in real federalism. Now, Hugh Williamson was an ardent supporter of the Constitution, a proponent of it. He was a friend of the Constitution, and he's forgotten. But Williamson was one of these states' writers who said, look, the Constitution would maintain the Union as under the Articles of Confederation. We have nothing to worry about. And so that's the important thing you need to get out of the friends of the Constitution, the proponents. And this is the founders' Constitution. Forget about the used car salesmen like Alexander Hamilton or James Wilson, because that's what they were. Focus on people, but even Wilson and Hamilton both said that, look, you have nothing to fear in this Constitution because we can only do in the federal government what is written down and codified in the written document itself. We can't go beyond those powers. Anything that we do beyond those powers is null and void, and this is where nullification comes from. This is how it was sold to the states during the ratification period. So we get back to the local community having control over their own lives and the lives of the people in those communities, not Massachusetts controlling South Carolina or South Carolina controlling Massachusetts. That was seen as immoral and unjust. This is exactly what people in the founding generation were saying when they were trying to sell the Constitution to reluctant individuals. And that's all that Benner gets into here. And I've promised Dave that I would review his book, and I will. And I'll mention his book. It's Compact of the Republic, the League of States, and the Constitution. I just haven't had time to write down the review, but it is a good book. And he gets into this idea of real federalism and where it comes from and British antecedents and takes that through the founding generation. So it's a very good book. It is available on Amazon. His name is Dave Benner. Again, Compact of the Republic, the League of States, and the Constitution. I would recommend picking it up. And Williamson was one of these guys that we need to focus on. He's not as famous as people like Jefferson or Madison or John Rutledge, but he was one of these states' writers who said, look, you have nothing to fear from the general government because the general government's powers will always be circumscribed by the written Constitution. And so we need to remember that when we're talking about the Constitution. People should be able to defend the Constitution based on the writings of these early proponents, these early friends of the Constitution. That's the Constitution that was sold to the states and that we should be following today. That's what Dr. Wilson was talking about in restoring the presidency. This is the idea of Jeffersonian self-determination and Jeffersonian freedom of association. This is exactly what the Abbeville Institute stands for. And so if you believe in these things, support us. Support our cause. Support our conferences. Support our efforts like this podcast and our website. Again, you can donate at www.abbevilleinstitute.org. That's it for this week. That's the Week in Review of the Abbeville Institute. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back next week. Until then, good day.